Chapter 13 of The Poor Little Rich Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Poor Little Rich Girl by Eleanor Gates. Chapter 13. So far the Piper had seemed to be no one's friend, unless perhaps his own. He had lagged along, surly or boisterous by turns, and careless of his manners, not even showing respect to the Man Who Makes Faces and the Policeman. But now Gwendolyn remarked a change in him, for as he spoke to her he took his pipe out of his mouth, under the pretext of cleaning it. "Say," he began in a cautious undertone, "I'll give you some advice about Jane." Gwendolyn was looking about her at the Zoo. Its roofs seemed countless. They touched, having no streets between them anywhere, and reached as far as she could see. They were all heights, all shapes, all varieties, some being level, others coming to a point at one corner, a few ending in a tower. One tower, on the outermost edge of the Zoo, was square and tapered. "Jane?" she said indifferently. "Oh, she's only a top." "Only a top!" It was the little old gentleman. "Why, that makes her all the more dangerous." "Because she's spinning so fast." The Policeman balanced on one arm while he shook an emphatic finger. "That she'll stir up trouble." "Well, then, what shall I do?" asked Gwendolyn. For, elated over seeing Thomas disposed of so completely, and yet with so much mercy, she was impatient at hearing that she still had reason to fear the nurse. The Piper took his time about replying. He sharpened one end of a match, thrust the bit of pine into the stem of his pipe, jabbed away industriously, threw away the match, blew through the stem once or twice, and turned the bowl upside down to make it plop, plop against a palm. Then, "Keep Jane laughin'," he counseled, "and see what happens." Jane was alongside, spinning comfortably on her shoe leather point. Now, as if she had overheard, or guessed a plot, sudden uneasiness showed on both her countenances, and she increased her speed. "You done up Thomas, the lot of you!" she charged, as she whirled away. "But you don't get me." "And we won't," declared Gwendolyn, "if we don't hurry up and trip her." "A good idear," chimed in the Piper. "If we only had some string!" cried the little old gentleman. "String won't do," said the Policeman. "We need rope." There was a high wind sweeping the roofs, and as the three began to run about, searching, it fluttered the Policeman's coat tails, swelled out the Piper's cap, and tugged at the ragged garb of the Man Who Makes Faces. "Here's a piece of clothes line." The Policeman made the find, catching sight of the line where it dangled from the edge of a roof. The others hastened to join him, and each seized the rope in both hands, the Piper staying at one end of it, the little old gentleman at the opposite, while Gwendolyn and the Policeman posted themselves at proper distances between. Then forward in a row swept all, carrying the rope with them. It was a curious one of its kind, as black as if it had been tarred, thick at the middle, but noticeably thin at one end. Jane saw their design. "Bah!" she mocked. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm goin' to turn the big rock. Then you'll see." And she made straight toward the square tower in the distance. "Oh!" It was the little old gentleman, beard blown sidewise by the wind. "We mustn't let her." The Piper in his excitement jounced the pig so hard that it squealed. "We ought to be able," he panted, "to manage a top." "Jane!" bellowed the policeman, galloping hard. "You must not injure that shaft." Then Gwendolyn realized that the square tower toward which the nurse was spinning was the Big Rock. And she recognized it as a certain great pillar of pink granite, up and down the sides of which, deep cut by chisels, were written strange words. It rose just ahead. Answering the officer with a shrill, scoffing laugh, Jane bore down upon it. Aided by the wind, she made top speed. There was not a moment to lose. Her pursuers fairly tore after her. And the Piper, who made the fastest progress, gained, until he was at her very heels. Then, with a final leap, he passed her, and circled, dragging the rope. It made a loop about the buttonless shoes, a loop that tightened as the little old gentleman came short, as the Piper halted. Each gave a pull. With disastrous result. For as the line came taut, up Jane went, caught bodily from the ground, and still spinning, whizzed forward in that high wind and struck the granite squarely. She fell to the ground, toppling sidewise, and bulking large. But the shaft! It began to move, slowly at first, to tip forward farther and farther, when, gaining velocity, with a great grinding noise, down from off the massive cube upon which it stood, it came crashing. Instantly a chorus of cries arose. "Oh, she's bumped over the obelisk! She's bumped over the obelisk!" With the cries, and sounding from beneath the tapered end of the Big Rock, mingled ferocious growls. "Roar! Roar! Roar! Roar!" And in that same moment the four who were holding the rope felt it begin to writhe and twist in their grasp, like a live thing. And its black length took on a scaly look, glittering in that pink glow as if it were covered with small ebon paillettes. It grew cold and clammy. At its thicker end Gwendolyn saw that the Piper was supporting a head with small fiery eyes, and a tongue flamelike in its color, and swift darting. Next, hiss! And with one hideous contortion the huge black body wrung itself free and coiled. Once Gwendolyn had boasted that she was not afraid of snakes. And now she did not flee, though the black coils were piled at her very feet. For she recognized the serpent. There was no mistaking that thin face and those small eyes. Moreover, a pocket handkerchief was bound around the reptilian jaws and tied at the top of the head in a bow knot. She had gotten rid of Thomas, but here was Miss Royle. There was no time for greetings. Again were sounding those furious growls. "Roar! Roar! Roar!" Jane swung round in a half circle to warn the governess. "It's that bear," she hummed. "Can't you drive him away?" Miss Royle began to uncoil. The policeman was tick-tocking up and down. "The din's damaged," he lamented. "Now who's goin' to pay?" demanded the Piper. "I'm afraid the Bear's hurt," declared the Man Who Makes Faces. In her eagerness to trip Jane, Gwendolyn had utterly forgotten the Bear's den. Now she saw it. A large cage, light in color, its bars woven closely together. And she saw, too, with horror, that what the policeman said was true. In falling, the Big Rock had broken the cover of the den. This cover was flopping up and down on its hinges. "Oh, he's loose!" she gasped. "Roar! Roar! Roar!" The Bear himself was knocking the cover into the air. The top of his head could be seen as he hopped about, evidently in pain. And now an extraordinary thing happened. A black, glittering body shot rustling through the grass to the side of the den. Then up went a scaly head, and forth darted a flaming tongue, driving the Bear back under the cover. At which the Bear rebelled, for his growls turned into a muffled protest.
"Now you stop, Miss Royle. I won't be treated like this. I won't!"
Then Gwendolyn understood Jane's hum, and why the governess had obeyed it so swiftly. The light colored cage with the loose cover was nothing else than the old linen hamper. As for the Bear, hair flying, cheeks crimson, eyes shining with quick tears of joy, she darted past Jane, leaped the glittering snake folds before the hamper, and swung the cover up on its hinges. "Puffy!" she cried. "Oh, Puffy!" It was indeed Puffy, with his plushy brown head, his bright shoe button eyes, his red tipped, sharply pointed nose, his adorably tiny ears, and deep cut, tightly shut, determined mouth. It was Puffy, as dear as ever, as old and as squashy. He stood up in the hamper to look at her, leaning his front paws, in a rather dignified manner, on the broken edge of the basketry. He was breathing hard from his contest, but smiling nevertheless.
"Oh," he said affably. "The poor little rich girl, I see."
Gwendolyn's first impulse was to take him up in her arms. But his proud air, combined with the fact that he had grown tremendously, caused her to check the impulse. "How do you do?" she inquired politely.
"I'm pretty shabby, thank you."
"Oh, it's so good to hear your voice again!" she exclaimed. "When you left, I didn't have a chance to tell you good by." It was then that she noticed a white something fluttering at his breast, just under his left foreleg. "Excuse me," she said apologetically, "but aren't you losing your pocket handkerchief?" Sadly he shook his head.
"It's my stuffing,"
he explained, and gently withdrawing his paw from her eager grasp, laid it upon his breast.
"You see, the big rock."
The little old gentleman was beside him, examining the wound, muttering to himself. "Can you mend him?" asked Gwendolyn. "Oh, Puffy!" The little old gentleman began to empty his pockets of the articles with which he had provided himself: the ear, the handful of hair, the plump cheek. "Ah! Ah!" he breathed, as he examined each one, and to and fro wagged the grizzled beard. "I'm afraid I must have help. This is a case that will require a specialist." The tone was so solemn that it frightened her. "Oh, do you mean we need a doctor?" Puffy was trembling weakly.
"I lost some cotton batting once before," he half whispered to Gwendolyn. "It was when you were teething. Oh, I know it was unintentional. You were so little. But I can't spare any more."
Down into the patch pocket went her hand. Out came the lip case. She thrust it into his furry grasp. "Keep this," she bade, "till I come back. I'll go for the doctor." The Man Who Makes Faces leaned down. "Fly!" he urged. At that Jane began to circle once more. "La vie!" she hummed. "Don't you go. He'll give you nasty medicine." "Hiss!" chimed in Miss Royle, her bandaged head rising and lowering in assent. "He'll cut out your appendix." One moment she hesitated, feeling the old fear drive the blood from her cheeks to her wildly beating heart. Then she saw Puffy sway, half fainting. And obeying the command of the little old gentleman, she grasped her gingham dress at either side, held it out to its fullest width, and with the wind pouching the little skirt, left the high grass, passed up through the lights of the near by trees, and rose into the higher air. She gave a glance down as she went. How excitedly Jane was circling! How Miss Royle was lashing the ground! But the faces of the other three were smiling encouragement. And she flew for her very life. Lightly she went, as if there were nothing to her but her little gingham dress, as if that empty dress, having tugged at some swagging clothesline until it was free, were now being wafted across the roofs, the tree tops, the smooth windings of a road, to a bake shop, without doubt. For her nostrils caught the good smell of fresh bread. Suddenly the shop loomed ahead of her. She alighted to have a look at it. It was a round, high, stone building, with stone steps leading up to it from every side, and columns ranged in a circle at the top of the steps. Seated on the bottom step, engrossed in some task, was a man. As Gwendolyn looked at him, she told herself that the Man Who Makes Faces had given this customer such a nice face. The eyes in particular were kind. He had a large pan of bread dough beside him. Out of it now he gouged a spoonful, which he began to roll between his palms. And as he rolled the dough, it became rounder and rounder, until it was ball like. It turned browner and browner, too, precisely as if it were baking in his hands. When he was finished with it, he piled it to one side, atop other brown pellets. She advanced to speak. "Please," she began, pointing a small finger, "what is this place?" He glanced up. "This, little girl, is the pillory." The pillory! Instantly she knew what he was making bread pills. And the bread pills helped her to recognize him. She dimpled cordially. "I haven't seen you since I had the colic," she said, nodding. "But I know you. You're the Doctor." The Doctor was most cordial, shaking her hand gently. After which, naturally enough, he felt her pulse. "But there's nothing the matter with me," she protested. "It's my dear Puffy. You remember." Now he rose solemnly, selected a fresh baked pill, bowed to the right, again to the left, last of all to her, and presented the pill. "In that case, Miss Gwendolyn," he said, smiling down, "a toast." And, quite in contrast to the evening of her 7th birthday anniversary, toast there was, deliciously crisp and crunchy. "Oo! How good!" she exclaimed, not nibbling conventionally, but taking big bites. "'Cause I hate cake." The next moment she became aware of the munching of others, and on looking round, found that she was back at the Den. She was not surprised. Things had a way of coming to pass in a pleasantly instantaneous fashion. And she was glad to see the little old gentleman, the Piper, and the Policeman each fairly gobbling up a pellet. Miss Royle was eating, too, and Jane was stuffing both mouths. But Puffy was having quite different fare. In front of him stood the Doctor, busily feeding filmy white bits into the tear just under a foreleg. "I think you'll find," assured the latter, "that a proper amount of cotton batting is most refreshing." "Once I wanted Jane to take me to the doll hospital," complained Puffy, his shoe button eyes hard with resentment. "But she said I was only a little beast." Gwendolyn looked severe. "Jane, you'll be sorry for that," she scolded. "Aha! My dear," said the Man Who Makes Faces, addressing the nurse. "At last one of your chickens is coming home to roost." Gwendolyn glanced up, and sure enough, a chicken was going past, a small blue hen, who looked exceedingly fagged. This was an occurrence worth noting. How often had she heard the selfsame remark, and never seen as much as a feather! Jane also saw the blue hen, and appeared much disconcerted. "I think I'll take 40 winks," she hummed. "20 for the front face, and 20 for the back." Whereupon she made a few quick revolutions, landing up against the granite base of the obelisk. The Doctor had been sewing up the tear in Puffy's coat. Now he finished his seam and knotted the thread. "There!" said he cheerily. "You're as good as new."
"Thank you," said Puffy. "And I feel so grateful to you, Miss Gwendolyn, that I must repay your kindness. You've always heard a certain statement about Jane yonder. Well, I'm going to prove that it's true."
"What's true?" asked Gwendolyn, puzzled. He made no answer, but after a short whispered conference with the Policeman, turned his back and began sniffing and snarling under his breath, while a fore paw was busy in the region of his third rib. When he faced round again, the shoe button eyes were shining triumphantly, and he was holding both fore paws together tightly.
"I found one!"
he cried, and wobbling over to Jane, stationed himself on one side of her, at the same time motioning the Officer to steal around to the other side on quiet hands. And now Gwendolyn saw that Jane, though she was only feigning sleep, was ignorant of what was happening. For her double equipment of faces had its disadvantages. Even when upright, she had not been able to roll one eye forward while its mate was on guard in the rear. And reclining flat upon her back, she could not rumble her eyes forward to her front face, for the reason that they would not roll uphill. Both stayed in the back of her head, where they could see only the ground. Very cautiously Puffy put his fore paws to Jane's ear, suddenly separated them, and waited. A moment. Then,
"Well, finding this out, you can wager I don't stay heels over head no more,"
cried the Policeman. And with a wriggle and a twist and a bound, he gave a half somersault and stood on his feet. At once the bottoms of his trouser legs came down over his shoes. His coat tails fell about him properly, uncovering his shield and his belt. And his club took its place at his right side. "Ouch!" he exclaimed, and began to scratch hard at the spot just between his shoulder blades. At the same time the tears that were in his cap flowed out and down his face, so that he seemed to be weeping. The Doctor, leaning close beside Gwendolyn, was all sympathy. "There's no reason to feel bad," he said kindly. "The operation was successful."
"Feel bad?" repeated the Policeman. "Why, I'm laughing! Ha! Ha! We put a flea in her ear."
At that Jane began to laugh.
"Oh, laws!" she exclaimed, sleeve to mouth once more. "I never heard the like of it." "Rah!" growled Puffy, delighted. "The plan is working. See her grow." "That flea went in one ear and came out the other," declared the little old gentleman, poking Jane with the toe of a worn shoe. Jane laughed the harder. "Oh, it's awful funny!" she cried, rocking herself to and fro, and steadily increasing her girth. Ho, ho, ho! "We've proved that you're empty headed," said Puffy. And now the nurse was seized by a very paroxysm of mirth. Both faces distorted, she whooped over and over. "That's right! Split your sides a laughin'!" cried the Piper. At these words sudden terror showed on her face. For the first time she saw the trap into which she had been led. Yet she could not check her laughter. "Oh ho!" she gasped hysterically. "Oh ho!" It was her last. Black sateen could stand no more. She gave a final and feeble rock. Both revolving faces paled. Then there sounded a loud pop! Like the bursting of an automobile tire. Next, a ripping "Look!" cried Gwendolyn. There were great rents down the front seams of Jane's waist. The nurse guessed what had happened, and clutched desperately at the gaping seams with both fat hands, now in front, now at the sides, striving to hold the rips together. To no avail. All the laughter was gone out of her. Quickly she collapsed, her sateen hanging in loose, ragged strips. Once more she was just ordinary nursemaid size. "Oh, will she die?" asked Gwendolyn, anxiously. The doctor knelt to grasp Jane's wrist. "No," he replied gravely. "She'll only have to go back to the employment agency." "I won't!" cried Jane. "I won't! Miss Royle!" Hiss! "Get you know what out of the way. A certain person mustn't talk to it. If she does, she'll find " "I understand," hissed back the snake. You know what? Gwendolyn was troubled. Now the Policeman and the Piper, assisted by Puffy, picked the nurse up and packed her into the linen hamper. Whereupon the little old gentleman slapped down the cover and tied a large tag to it. On the tag was written, "Employment Agency, Down Town." "I'm done with her," said Gwendolyn, "if she is a perfectly good top." "You're rid of me," answered Jane, calling through the weave of the hamper. "Yes, but what about Miss Royle?" "We'll send her back, too," declared the Man Who Makes Faces. "Here! Where are you?" He ran about, searching. The others searched also through the grass, behind the granite shaft, everywhere. Concern sobered each face. For the snake in the grass was gone. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Poor Little Rich Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Poor Little Rich Girl by Eleanor Gates, Chapter 14. Why had Miss Royle, sly reptile that she was, scuttled away without so much as a good bye? "Oh, dear," sighed Gwendolyn. "Just as soon as one trouble's finished, another one starts." "We must get on her track," declared the Policeman, patrolling to and fro anxiously.
"And let's hurry," urged the Man Who Makes Faces. "It's coming night in the city, and all these lights'll be needed soon."
Very soon indeed. For even as he spoke it happened, with a sharp click. Instantly the pink glow was blotted out. As suddenly thick blackness shut down. Except straight ahead. There Gwendolyn made out an oblong patch of sky in which were a few dim stars.
"Never mind. went on the little old gentleman soothingly, "because we're close to the place where there's light all the time."
"All the time?" repeated Gwendolyn, surprised.
"It's where light grows."
"Grows?"
"Well, it's where candle light grows."
"Candle light!" she cried. "You mean oh, it's where my father comes!"
"Sometimes.
"Will he be there now?"
Only the bird can tell us that."
Then she understood Jane's last gasping admonition. Get you know what out of the way. A certain person mustn't talk to it. If she does, she'll find It was the Doctor's hand that steadied her as she hurried forward in the darkness. It was a big hand, and she was able to grasp only 2 fingers of it. But that clinging hold made her feel that their friendship was established. She was not at all surprised at her complete change of attitude toward him. It seemed to her now as if he and she had always been on good terms. The others were near. She could hear the tinkle tankle of the Piper's pipes, the scuff of Puffy's paws, the labored breathing of the little old gentleman as he trudged, the heavy tramp, tramp of the policeman. She made her bare feet travel as fast as she could, and kept her look steadily ahead on the dim stars. And saw, moving from one to another of them in quick darts, now up, now down, a small something. She did not instantly guess what it was, flitting across that half darkened sky, until she heard the wild beating of tiny pinions. "Why, it's a bird!" she exclaimed.
"A bird?"
repeated the policeman, all eagerness.
"Must be the bird,"
declared the Man Who Makes Faces triumphantly. It was. Even in the poor light her eager eyes made out the bumps on that small feathered head, and saw that on the down drooping tail, nicely balanced and gleaming whitely, was a lump. Remembering what she had heard about that bit of salt, she ran forward. At her approach his wings half lifted, and as she reached out to him, pointing a small finger, he sprang sidewise, alighting upon it. "Oh, I'm glad you've come," he panted. He was no larger than a canary, and seemed to be brown, a sparrow brown. Prejudiced against him, she had been. He had tattled about her worse, about her father. Yet, seeing him now, so tiny and ruffled and frightened, she liked him. She brought him to a level with her eyes. "What's the matter?" she asked soothingly. "I'm afraid." He thrust out his head, pointing. "Look!" She looked. Ahead, the tops of the grass blades were swaying this way and that in a winding path, as if from the passage of some crawling thing.
"She tried to get me out of the way."
"Oh, tell me, where is my father?"
"Why, of course. They say he's "
He did not finish. Or if he did, she heard no end to the sentence. Of a sudden her face had grown almost painfully hot, as a great yellow light flamed against it, a light that shimmered up dazzlingly from the surface of a broad treeless field. This field was like none that she had ever imagined, for its acres were neatly sodded with mirrors. The little company was on the beveled edge of the field. To halt them, and conspicuously displayed, was a sign. It read, "Keep off the glass." "Keep off the glass," read Gwendolyn.
"And I don't wonder, 'cause we'd crack it." "We don't crack it. We cross it,"
reminded the Man Who Makes Faces, and stepped boldly upon the gleaming plate.
"My, my!" exclaimed the Piper. "Ain't there a fine crop this year?"
A fine crop! Gwendolyn glanced down, and saw for the first time that the mirrored acres were studded, flower like, with countless silk shaded candles. What curious candles they were! They did not grow horizontally, as she had imagined they must, but upright and candle like. Above their sticks, which were of brass, silver, and decorated porcelain, was a flame, ruddy of tip, sharply pointed, but fat and yellow at the base, where the soft white wax fed the fire. At the other end of the sticks, as like the top light as if it were a perfect reflection, was a second flame. These were candles that burned at both ends. And this was the region she had traveled so far to find! Her heart beat so wildly that it stirred the plaid of the little gingham dress.
"Say, I hear a quacking,"
announced Puffy, staring up into the sky. Gwendolyn heard it too. It seemed to come from across the field of double ended candles. She peered that way to where a heavy fringe of trees walled the farther side greenily. She saw him first, while the others, excepting the Bird, were still staring skyward. At the start, what she discerned was only a faint outline on the tree wall, the outline of a man, broad shouldered, tall, but a trifle stooped. It was faint for the reason that it blended with the trees, for the man was garbed in green. As he advanced into the field, the chorus of quacks grew louder, and presently Gwendolyn caught certain familiar expressions.
"Oh, don't bother me. Sit up straight, miss. Sit up straight."
This a rather deep quack.
"My dear child, you have no sense of time." And "What on earth ever put such a question into your head?"
She concluded that the expressions were issuing from the large, bell shaped horn which was pointed her way over one shoulder of the man in green. The talking machine to which the horn was attached a handsome mahogany affair he carried on his back. It was not unlike a hand organ, which made Gwendolyn wonder if he was not the Man Who Makes Faces' brother. She glanced back inquiringly at the little old gentleman. Either the stranger was a relation, and not a popular one, or else the quacking expressions annoyed, for the Man Who Makes Faces was scowling, and
"Cavil, criticism, correction,"
he scolded half to himself. He in green now began to move about and gather silk shaded candles, bending this way and that to pluck them, and paying not the slightest attention to the group of watchers in plain view. But not one of these was indifferent to his presence. And all were acting in a most incomprehensible manner. With one accord, Doctor and Piper, Bear and Policeman, Face Maker and Bird were rubbing hard at the palm of one hand. There being no trees close by, the men used the sole of a shoe, while Puffy raked away at one paw with the claws of the others, and the Bird pecked a foot with his beak. And yet Gwendolyn could not believe that it was really he. The Policeman drew near.
"You've heard of Hobson's choice?" he inquired in a low voice. "Perhaps this is Hobson, or Sam Hill, or Punch, or Great Scott."
The Man Who Makes Faces shook his head.
"You don't know him," he answered, "because recently, when the bears were bothering him a lot in his street, I made him a long face."
The man in green was pausing where the candles clustered thickest. Gwendolyn, still doubtful, went forward to greet him. "How do you do, sir?" she began, curtsying. His face was long, as the Man Who Makes Faces had pointed out, very long, and pale, and haggard. Between his sunken temples burned his dark rimmed eyes. His nose was thin, and over it the skin was drawn so tightly that his nostrils were pinched. His lips were pressed together, driving out the blood. His cheeks were hollow, and shadowed bluely by a day old beard. He had on a hat, yet she was able, curiously enough, to note that his hair was sparse over the top of his head, and streaked with gray. Nevertheless, there was no denying that she recognized him dimly. Something knotted in her throat at seeing weariness, anxiety, even torture in those deep set eyes.
"I think I've met you before somewhere," she faltered. "Your long face."
The bird was perched on the forefinger of one hand. She proffered the other. He did not even look at her. "My hands are full," he declared. And again, "My hands are full." She glanced at them, and saw that each was indeed full of paper money. Moreover, the green of his coat was the green of new, crisp bills, while his buff colored trousers were made of yellowish ones, carefully creased. He was literally made of money. Now she felt reasonably certain of his identity. Yet she determined to make even more sure.
"Would you mind just turning around for a moment?" she inquired.
"But I'm busy to day," he protested. "I can't be bothered with little girls. I'll see you when you're 8 years old." Nevertheless, he faced about accommodatingly. The moment he turned his back he displayed a detail of his dress that had not been visible before. This detail, at first glance, appeared to be a smart leather piping. On second glance it seemed a sort of shawl strap contrivance by which the talking machine was suspended. But in the end she knew what it was, a leather harness, an exceedingly handsome, silver buckled, hand sewed harness. She went around him and raised a smiling face caught at a hand, too and felt her own happy tears make cool streaks down her cheeks.
I don't see you often," she said. But I know you just the same. You're my father."
At that he glanced down at her, stooped, picked a candle, and held it close to her face. "Poor little girl," he said. "Poor little girl."
"Poor little rich girl," she prompted, noting that he had left out the word.
She heard a sob. The next moment rustle, rustle, rustle. And at her feet the gay topped candles were bent this way and that, as Miss Royle, with an artful serpent smile on her bandaged face, writhed her way swiftly between them.
"Dearie!"
she hissed, making an affectionate half coil about Gwendolyn.
"What do you think I'm going to say to you?"
Gwendolyn only shook her head.
"Guess, darling,"
encouraged the governess, coiling herself a little closer.
"Maybe you're going to say, 'Use your dictionary,'" ventured Gwendolyn. "Oh, dearie!"
chided Miss Royle, managing a very good blush for a snake. But now Gwendolyn guessed the reason for the other's sudden display of affection. For that scaly head was rising out of the grass, inch by inch, and those glittering serpent eyes were fixed upon the Bird. Unable to move, he watched her, plumage on end, round eyes fairly starting. "Cheep! Cheep!" At his cry of terror, the Doctor interposed. "I think we'd better take the Bird out of here," he said. "The less noise, the better." And with that he lifted the small frightened thing from Gwendolyn's finger. Miss Royle, quite thrown off her poise, sank hissing to the ground.
"My neuralgia's worse than ever this evening,"
she complained, affecting not to notice his interference. "Huh!" he grunted. "Keep away from bargain counters." The Piper came jangling up. "That snake belongs in her case," he declared, addressing the Doctor. More than once Gwendolyn had wondered why the Piper had burdened himself, to all appearances uselessly and foolishly, with the various pieces of lead pipe. But now what wily forethought she granted him! For with a few quick flourishes of the wrench, she saw him join them, end to end, to form one length. This he threw to the ground, after which he gave a short, sharp whistle. In answer to it, the bird fluttered down, and entered one end of the pipe, giving, as he disappeared from sight, one faint cheep. Miss Royle heard. Her scaly head glittered up once more. Her beady eyes shone. Her tongue darted hate. Then, little by little, that long black body began to move toward the pipe. A moment, and she entered it. Another, and the last foot of rustling serpent had disappeared. Then out of the farther end of the pipe bounced the bird. Whereat the Piper sprang to the bird's side, produced a nut, and screwed it on the pipe end. "How's that?" he cried triumphantly. The pipe rolled partly over. A muffled voice came from it, railing at him. "Be careful what you do, young man. I saw you had that bonnet of mine." "Oh, can a snake crawl backwards?" demanded Gwendolyn, excitedly. The Piper answered with a harsh laugh, and scrambling the length of the lead pipe, fell to hammering in a plug. Miss Royle was a prisoner. The bird bounced very high. "That's a feather in your cap," he declared joyously, advancing to the Piper, and suiting the action to the word, pulled a tiny plume from his own wing, fluttered up, and thrust it under the band of the other's greasy head gear.
"Think how that governess has treated me," growled Puffy, "when I was in your nursery, and was old and a little worn out. How I would have appreciated care and repair!"
"The employment agency for her," said the Piper.
"I'll attend to that," added the Policeman.
Gwendolyn's father had been gathering candles, and had seemed not to see what was transpiring. Now, as if he was satisfied with his load, he suddenly started away in the direction he had come. His firm stride jolted the talking machine not a little. The quacking cries recommenced. "Please to pay me. Let me sell you. Let me borrow. Won't you hire? Quack, quack, quack." After him hurried the others, in an excited group. The Piper led it, his plumbing tools jangling, his pig poke a swing. And Gwendolyn saw him grin back over a shoulder craftily, then lay hold of her father and tighten a strap. She trudged in the rear. She had found her father, and he could only see the candles he sought, and the money in his grasp. She was out in the open with him once more, where she was free to gambol and shout. Yet he was bound by his harness, and heavily laden. "I might just as well be home," she said to Puffy, disheartened.
"Wish your father'd let me sharpen his ears,"
whispered the Man Who Makes Faces. He shifted the hand organ to the other shoulder. The Doctor had a basket on his arm. He peered into it. "I haven't a thing about me," he declared, "but a bread pill."
"How would a glass of soda water do?"
suggested the Policeman in an undertone. "Why, of course!" It had happened before that the mere mention of a thing brought that thing swiftly. Now it happened again. For immediately Gwendolyn heard the rush and bubble and brawl of a narrow mountain stream. Next, looking down from the summit of a gentle rise, she saw the smoky windings of the unbottled soda. The Doctor was a man of action. Though the Policeman had made his suggestion only a second before, here was the former already leaning down to the stream, and, having dipped, was walking in the midst of the little company, glass in hand. Gwendolyn rushed forward. "Father!" she called. "Please have a drink." Her father shook his head. "I'm not thirsty," he declared, utterly ignoring the proffered glass. "I was 'fraid he wouldn't," sighed Gwendolyn, head down again, and scuffing bare feet in the cool, damp grass of the stream side, yet not enjoying it. The lights had changed. The double ended candles had disappeared. Filling the land once more with a golden glow were countless tapers electric, gas, and kerosene. She was back where she had started, threading the trees among which she had danced with joy. But she was far from dancing now. "Let's not give up hope," said a voice the Doctor's. He was holding up the glass before his face to watch the bubbles creaming upon its surface. "There may be a sudden turn for the better." Before she could draw another breath, here was the turn a sharp one. And she felt a keen wind in her eyes, blown in gusts as if by the wings of giant butterflies. The cloud that held the wind lay just ahead, a pinky mass that stretched from sky to earth. The Bird turned his dark eyes upon Gwendolyn from where he sat, high and safe on the Doctor's shoulder. "I think her little journey's almost done," he said. There was a rich canary note in his voice. "Oh, goody!" she cried.
You mean you have a solution?
asked the little old gentleman. "A solution?" called back the Piper. "Well?" A moment's perfect stillness. Then, "It's simple," said the Bird. Now his voice was strangely like the Doctor's. "I suppose you might call it a salt solution." His last three words began to run through Gwendolyn's mind. A salt solution! A salt solution! A salt solution! As regularly as the pulse that throbbed in her throat. "Yes!" The Doctor's voice now, breathless, low, tremulous with anxiety. "If we want to save her " "Am I her?" interrupted Gwendolyn. And again somebody sobbed. "It must be done." "There isn't anything to cry about," declared Gwendolyn stoutly. She felt hopeful, even buoyant. It was all novel and interesting. The Doctor began by making grabs at the lump of salt on the Bird's tail. The lump loosened suddenly. He caught it between his palms, after which he began to roll it, precisely as he had rolled the dough at the pillory. And as the salt worked into a more perfect ball, it slowly browned. Gwendolyn clapped her hands. "My father won't know the difference!" she cried. "You get my idea exactly," answered the Bird. The Doctor uncovered the pill basket, selected a fine, round, toasted example of his own baking, and presented it to the Man Who Makes Faces, presented a second to Gwendolyn, thence went from one to another of the little company, whereat every one fell to eating. At once Gwendolyn's father looked round the circle of picnickers, as if annoyed by the crunching. But when the Doctor held out the brown salt, he took it, examined it critically, turned it over and over, then lifted it and bit. "Pretty slim lunch, this," he observed. He ate heartily until the last salt crumb was gone. Then, "I'm thirsty," he declared. "Where's " Instantly the Doctor proffered the glass. And the other drank, in one great gasping mouthful. "Ah!" breathed Gwendolyn, and felt a grateful coolness on her lips, as if she had slaked her own thirst. The next moment her father turned, and she saw that the change had already come. First of all, he looked down at his hands. caught sight of the crumpled bills, and attempted to stuff them hurriedly into his pocket. But his pockets were already wedged tight with silk shaded candles. He reached round and fed the bills into the mahogany case of the talking machine. Next he emptied his pockets of the double ended candles, frowned at them, and threw them to one side to wilt. Last of all, he spied a bit of leather strap and pulled at it impatiently. Whereupon, with a clear ring of its silver mountings, his harness fell about his feet. He smiled and stepped out of it, as out of a cast off garment. This quick movement shook up the talking machine, and at once voices issued from the great horn, shrilly protesting into his ear. "Quack! Quack! Kommt, Fräulein! Une fille stupide! Get up! Honk! Honk! Honk!" And then, rippling upward, to the accompaniment of dancing feet, a scale on a piano. He peered into the horn. "When did I come by this?" he demanded. "Well, I shan't carry it another step." And moving his shoulders as if they ached, let the talking machine slip sidewise to the glass. There was a crank attached to one side of the machine. This he grasped, and while he continued to stuff bills into the mahogany box with one hand, he turned the crank with the other. Gwendolyn had often marveled at the way bands of music, voices of men and women, chimes of clocks, and bugle calls could come out of the self same place. Now this was made clear to her. For as her father whirled the crank, out of the horn, in a little procession, waddled the creatures who had quacked so persistently. There were 6 of them in all. One wore patent leather pumps. One had a riding whip. The third was in motor livery, buff and blue. Another waddled with an air unmistakably French. Feathers formed a boa about her neck. The next advanced firmly, a metronome swinging on a slender pince nez chain. The last of all carried a German dictionary. Her father observed them gloomily. "That's the kind of ducks and drakes I've been making out of my money," he declared. The procession quacked loudly, as if glad to get out, and waddled toward the stream. "Why," cried Gwendolyn, "there's Monsieur Tellegen! And my riding master! And the chauffeur! And my French teacher! And my music teacher! And my His eyes rested upon her then, and she saw that he knew her. "Oh, daddy!" the tender name she loved to call him. "Little daughter! Little daughter!" She felt his arms about her, pressing her to him. His pale face was close. "When my precious baby is strong enough " he began. "I'm strong now." She gripped his fingers. "We'll take a little jaunt together." "We must have mother with us, daddy. Oh, dear daddy!" "We'll see mother soon," he said. "Very soon." She brushed his cheek with searching fingers. "I think we'd better start right away," she declared. "'Cause isn't this a rain drop on your face?" End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Poor Little Rich Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Poor Little Rich Girl by Eleanor Gates. Chapter 15. Without another moment's delay, Gwendolyn and her father set forth, traveling a road that stretched forward beside the stream of soda. winding as the stream wound, to the music of the fuming water, music with a bass of deep pool notes. How sweet it all was! Underfoot the dirt was cool. It yielded itself deliciously to Gwendolyn's bare tread. Overhead, shading the way, were green boughs, close lace, but permitting glimpses of blue. Upon this arbor, bouncing along with an occasional chirp of contentment, and with the air of one who has assumed the lead, went the Bird. Gwendolyn's father walked in silence, his look fixed far ahead. Trotting at his side, she glanced up at him now and then. She did not have to dread the coming of Jane, or Miss Royle, or Thomas. Yet she felt concern on the score of keeping beside him, of having ready a remark, gay or entertaining, should he show signs of being bored. No sooner did the thought occur to her than the Bird was ready with a story. He fluttered down to the road, hunted a small brush from under his left wing, and scrubbed carefully at the feathers covering his crop. "Now I can make a clean breast of it," he announced. "Oh, you're going to tell us how you got the lump?" asked Gwendolyn eagerly. The feathers over his crop were spotless. He nodded, and tucked away the scrubbing brush. "Once upon a time," he began. She dimpled with pleasure. "I like stories that start that way," she interrupted. "Once upon a time," he repeated, "I was just an ordinary sparrow, hopping about under the kitchen window of a residence, busily picking up crumbs. While I was thus employed, the cook in the kitchen happened to spill some salt on the floor. Being a superstitious creature, she promptly threw a lump of it over her shoulder. Well, the kitchen window was open, and the salt went through it and lit on my tail." Here he pointed his beak to where the crystal had been. "And no sooner did it get firmly settled on my feathers " "The first person who came along could catch you!" cried Gwendolyn. "Jane told me that." "Jane?" said the Bird. "The fat, two-faced woman that was my nurse." The Bird ruffled his plumage. "Well, of course, she knew the facts," he admitted. "You see, she was the cook." "Oh!" "As long as that lump was on my tail," resumed the Bird, "anybody could catch me, and send me anywhere. And nobody ever seemed to want to take the horrid load off, with salt so cheap." "Did you do errands for my father?" Her father answered. "Messages and messages and messages," he murmured wearily. There was a rustle as of paper. "Mostly financial." He sighed. "Sometimes my work has eased up a trifle," went on the Bird, more cheerily. "That's when They hired Jack Robinson, because he's so quick." "Oh, yes, you worked for They," said Gwendolyn. "Please, who are They? And what do They look like? And how many are there of 'em?" Ahead was a bend in the road. He pointed it out with his bill. "You know," said he, "it's just as good to turn a corner as a stone. For there They are now." He gave an important bounce. She rounded the bend on tiptoe. But when she caught sight of They, it seemed as if she had seen them many times before. They were two in number, and wore top hats, and plum-covered coats with black piping. They were standing in the middle of the road, facing each other. About their feet fluttered dingy feathers, and between them was a half-plucked crow, which They were picking. Once she had wanted to thank They for the pocket in the new dress. Now she felt as if it would be ridiculous to mention patch pockets to such stately personages. So, leaving her father, she advanced modestly and curtsied.
"How do you do, they?" she began. "I'm glad to meet you." They stared at her without replying. They were alike in face as well as in dress, even in their haughty expression of countenance. "I've heard about you so often," went on Gwendolyn, "I feel I almost know you. And I've heard lots of things that you've said. Aren't you always saying things?"
"Saying things," they repeated.
She was astonished to find that they spoke in chorus.
"Well, it's often so and so that does the talking, but we get the blame." Now they glared.
Gwendolyn, realizing that she had been unfortunate in the choice of a subject, hastened to reassure them. "Oh, I don't want to blame you," she protested, "for things you don't do." At that they smiled.
"I blame him, and he blames me," they answered. "In that way we shift the responsibility."
At which Gwendolyn nodded understandingly.
"And since we always hunt as a couple,"
here they pulled fiercely at the feathers of the captured bird between them,
"nobody ever knows who really is to blame."
they cast aside the crow then, and led the way along the road, walking briskly. Behind them walked the Policeman, one hand to his cap.
"Say, please don't put me off the force," he begged.
Grass and flowers grew along the center of the road. No sooner did the Policeman make his request than they moved across this tiny hedge and traveled one side of the road, giving the other side over to the Officer. Whereupon he strode abreast of they, swinging his night stick thoughtfully. The walking was pleasant there by the stream side. The fresh breeze caressed Gwendolyn's cheeks, and swirled her yellow hair about her shoulders. She took deep breaths through nostrils swelled to their widest. "Oh, I like this place best in the whole world," she said earnestly. The next moment she knew why. For rounding another bend, she caught sight of a small boyish figure in a plaid gingham waist and jeans overalls. His tousled head was raised eagerly. His blue eyes shone. "Hoo hoo!" he called. She gave a leap forward. "Why, it's Johnnie Blake!" she cried. "Johnnie! Oh, Johnnie!" It was Johnnie. There was no mistaking that small freckled nose. "Say, don't you want to help dig worms?" he invited, and proffered his drinking cup. She needed no urging, but began to dig at once, and found bait in abundance, so that the cup was quickly filled, and she was compelled to use his ragged straw hat. "Oh, isn't this nice!" she exclaimed. "And after we fish, let's hunt a frog." "I know where there's tadpoles," boasted he, "and long legged bugs that can walk on the water, and oh, I want to stay here always." She had forgotten that there were others about. But now a voice her father's broke in upon her happy chatter. "Without your mother?" She had been sitting down. She rose and brushed her hands on the skirt of her dress. "I'll find my mother," she said. The little old gentleman was beside Johnnie, patting his shoulder and thrusting something into a riveted pocket. "There," he half whispered. "And tell your father to be sure to keep this nose away from the grindstone." Gwendolyn wrinkled her brows. But isn't Johnnie coming with me?" she asked. At that Johnnie shook his head vigorously. "Not away from here!" he declared. "No!" "No," repeated Puffy. "Not away from the woods and the stream and fishing and hunting frogs and tadpoles and water bugs. Why, he's the rich little poor boy." Well, then, I'll come back."
She moved away slowly, looking over a shoulder at him as she went.
"Don't forget, I'll come back." "I'll be here," he answered. "And I'll let you use my willow fish pole." He waved a hand.
There were carriage lamps along the stream now. Alternating with these were automobile lights, brass side lights, and larger brass search lights, all like great glowing eyes. Again They were in advance. "We can't be very far from the barn," they announced, and each waved his right arm in a half circle.
"Robin Hood's barn?"
whispered Gwendolyn. The policeman nodded. "The first people to go around it," said he, "were ladies who used feather dusters on the parlor furniture."
"I s'pose it's been built a long time,"
said Gwendolyn. "Ah, a long time." Her father was speaking. Now he halted and pointed down to a wide road that crossed the one she was traveling. "Just notice how that's been worn." The wide road had deep ruts. Also, here and there upon it were great bowl like holes. But a level strip between the ruts and the holes shone as if it had been tramped down by countless feet. "Around Robin Hood's barn," went on her father sadly. "How many have helped to wear that road! Not only her mother, but her mother before her, and then back and back as far as you can count."
"I can't count back very far," said Gwendolyn, "'cause I never have any time for 'rithmetic. I have to study my French, and my German, and my music, and my
Her father groaned. "I've traveled it, too," he admitted. She lifted her eyes then. And there, just across that wide road, was the Barn! Looming up darkly, a great framework of steel girders, all bolted together, and rusted in patches and streaks. Through these girders could be seen small regular spots of light.
"Nobody has to go around the barn," she protested. "Anybody could just go right in at one side and right out at the other."
"But the road," said her father meaningly. "If ever one's feet touch it " She thought the road wonderful. It was river wide, and full of gentle undulations. Where it was smoothest, it reflected the barn and all the surrounding lights. Yet now, like the shining tin of a roof top, it resounded to a footfall. "Some one's coming," announced the Piper. Buzz! It was a low, angry droning. The next moment a figure came into sight at the corner of the barn. It was a slender, girlish figure, and it came hurrying forward along the circular way with never a glance to right or left. Gwendolyn could see that whoever the traveler was, her dress was plain and scant. Nor were there ornaments shining in her pretty hair, which was unbound. She was shod in dainty, high heeled slippers. And now she walked as fast as she could. Again she broke into a run. But taking no note of the ruts and rough places, continually stumbled.
"She's watching what's in her hand," said the Man Who Makes Faces. "Contemplation, speculation, perlustration."
And he sighed. "She'll have a fine account to settle with me." This the Piper again. He whipped out his note book. "That's what I call a merry dance."
"See what she's carrying," advised the Bird.
In one hand the figure held a small, dark something. Gwendolyn looked.
Why," she began hesitatingly. "Isn't it a bonnet?"
A bonnet it was, A plain, cheap looking piece of millinery. Buzz! The drone grew loud. The figure caught the bonnet close to her face and held it there, turning it about anxiously. Her eyes were eager. Her lips wore a proud smile. It was then that Gwendolyn recognized her, and leaned forward, holding out her arms. "Moth er!" she plead. "Moth er!" Her mother did not hear. Or, if she heard, did not so much as lift her eyes from the bonnet. She tripped, regained her balance, and rushed past, hair wind tossed, dress fluttering. At either side of her, smoke curled away like silk veiling blown out by the swift pace. "Oh, she's burning!" cried Gwendolyn, in a panic of sudden distress. The Doctor bent down. "That's money," he explained. "Burning her pockets." "She can't see anything but the bee. She can't hear anything but the bee." It was Gwendolyn's father, murmuring to himself. The bee! Now the Bird came bouncing to Gwendolyn's side. "You've read that bees are busy little things, haven't you?" he asked. "Well, this particular social honey gathering insect that's the very one," she declared excitedly, "is no exception." "We must get it away from her," declared Gwendolyn. "Oh, how tired her poor feet must be!" As she said it, she was conscious of the burning ache of her own feet, and yet the tears that swam in her eyes were tears of sympathy, not of pain. "Puffy, won't you eat it?" Puffy blinked as if embarrassed. "Well, you see, a bee makes honey," he began lamely. The figure had turned a corner of the barn. Now, on the farther side of the great structure, it was flitting past the openings. Gwendolyn rested a hand on the wing of the Bird. "Won't you eat it?" she questioned. The Bird wagged his bumpy head. "It's against all the laws of this land," he declared. "But this is a society bee." "A bird isn't even allowed to eat a bad bee. But," chirping low, "I'll tell you what can be tried." "Yes?" "Ask your mother to trade her bonnet for the Piper's poke." Gwendolyn stared at him for a moment. Then she understood. "The poke's prettier," she declared. "Oh, if she only would! Piper!" The Piper swaggered up. "Some collecting on hand?" he asked. Swinging, as usual, from a shoulder was the poke. Gwendolyn thought she had never seen a prettier one. Its ribbon bows were fresh and smart. Its lace was snow white and neatly frilled. "Oh, I know she'll make the trade!" she exclaimed happily. The Piper considered the matter, pursing his lips around the pipe stem in his mouth, standing on one foot. Gwendolyn appealed to the Man Who Makes Faces. "Maybe Mother'll have to have her ears sharpened," she suggested. The little old gentleman shook his shaggy head. "Don't let her hear that pig," he warned darkly. "She'll come round in another moment." It was the Doctor, voice very cheery. At that the Piper unslung the poke and advanced to the edge of the road. "I've never wanted this crazy poke," he asserted over his shoulder to Gwendolyn. "Now I'll just get rid of it. And I'll present that bonnet with the bee," here he laughed harshly, "to a woman that hasn't footed a single one of my bills. Ha! Ha!" Buzz! Again that high, strident note. Gwendolyn's mother was circling into sight once more. Fortunately, she was keeping close to the outer edge of the road. The Piper faced in the direction she was speeding, and prepared to race beside her. Buzz! It was an exciting moment. She was holding out the bonnet as before. He thrust the poke between her face and it, carefully keeping the lace and the bows in front of her very eyes. "Madam!" he shouted. "Trade!" "Mother!" Her mother heard. Her look fell upon the poke. She slowed to a walk. "Trade!" shouted the Piper again, dangling the poke temptingly. She stopped short, gazing hard at the poke. "Trade?" she repeated coldly. Her voice sounded as if from a great distance. "Trade? Well, that depends upon what They say." Then she circled on, at such a terrible rate that the Piper could not keep pace. He ceased running and fell behind, breathing hard, and complaining ill temperedly. "Oh! Oh!" mourned Gwendolyn. The smoke blown bat from that fleeing figure smarted her throat and eyes. She raised an arm to shield her face. Disappointed, and feeling a first touch of weariness, she could not choke back a great sob that shook her convulsively. The Man Who Makes Faces, whiskers buried in his ragged collar, was nodding thoughtfully. "By and by," he murmured. "By and by. Presently. Later on." The Doctor was even more comforting. "There! There!" he said. "Don't cry." "But, oh!" breathed Gwendolyn, her bosom heaving. "Why don't you feel her pulse?"
It's terrible," faltered Gwendolyn's father. His agonized look was fixed upon the road. Now the road was indeed terrible. For there were great chasms in it, chasms that yawned darkly, that opened and closed as if by the rush and receding of water. Gwendolyn's mother crossed them in flitting leaps, as from one roof top to another. Her daintily shod feet scarcely touched the road, so swift was her going. A second, and she was whipped from sight at the Barn's corner. About her slender figure, as it disappeared, dust mingled with the smoke mingled and swirled, funnel like in shape, with a wide base and a narrow top, like the picture of a water spout in the back of Gwendolyn's geography. The Piper came back, wiping his forehead. "What does she care about a poke?" he scolded, flinging himself down irritably. "Ha! All she thinks about is what They say." At that, Gwendolyn's spirits revived. Somehow, instantly and clearly, she knew what should be done. But when she opened her mouth, she found that she could not speak. Her lips were dry. Her tongue would not move. She could only swallow. Then, just as she was on the point of throwing herself down and giving way utterly to tears, she felt a touch on her hand, a furry touch. Next, something was slipped into her grasp. It was the lip case. "Well, Mr. Piper," she cried out, "what do They say?" They were close by, standing side by side, gazing at nothing, for their eyes were wide open, their faces expressionless. Gwendolyn's father addressed them. "I never asked my wife to drop that sort of thing," he said gravely, "for Gwendolyn's sake. You might, I suppose." One hand was in his pocket. The two pairs of wide open eyes blinked once. The two mouths spoke in unison. "Money talks." Gwendolyn's father drew his hand from his pocket. It was filled with bills. "Will these " he began.
It was the Piper who snatched the money out of his hand and handed it to They. And, thinking it over afterward, Gwendolyn felt deep gratitude for the promptness with which They acted. For having received the money, They advanced into that terrible road, faced half about, and halted. The angry song of the bee was faint then, for the slender figure was speeding past those patches of light that could be seen through the girders of the barn. But soon the buzzing grew louder, as Gwendolyn's mother came into sight, shrouded and scarcely discernible. They met her as she came on, blocking her way, and "Madam!" they shouted, "trade your bonnet for the Piper's poke!" Gwendolyn held her breath. Her mother halted. Now, for the first time, she lifted her eyes and looked about, as if dazed and miserable. There was a flush on each smooth cheek. She was panting so that her lips quivered. The Piper rose and hurried forward. And seeing him, half timidly, she reached out a hand, a slender white hand. Quickly he relinquished the poke, but when she took it, made a cup of his two hands under it, as if he feared she might let it fall. The poke was heavier than the bonnet. She held it low, but looked at it intently, smiling a little. Presently, without even a parting glance, she held the bonnet out to him. "Take it away," she commanded. "It isn't becoming." He received it and promptly made off along the road, the bonnet held up before his face. "When it comes to chargin'," he called back, with an independent jerk of the head, "I'm the only chap that can keep ahead of a chauffeur." And he laughed uproariously. Gwendolyn's mother now began to admire the poke, turning it around, at the same time tilting her head to one side. This very like the bird. She fingered the lace, and picked at the ribbon. Then, having viewed it from every angle, she opened it, as if to put it on. There was a bounce and a piercing squeal. Then over the rim of the poke, with a thump as it hit the roadway, shot a small black and white pig. She dropped the poke and sprang back, frightened. And as the porker cut away among the trees, she wheeled, caught sight of Gwendolyn, and suddenly opened her arms. With a cry, Gwendolyn flung herself forward. No need now to fear harming an elegant dress, or roughing carefully arranged hair. "Mother!" She clasped her mother's neck, pressing a wet cheek against a cheek of satin. "Oh, my baby! My baby! Look at mother!" "I am looking at you," answered Gwendolyn, half sobbing and half laughing. "I've looked at you for a long time. 'Cause I love you so. I love you." The next moment the Man Who Makes Faces dashed suddenly aside to a near by flower bordered square of packed ground, over which, blazing with lights, hung one huge tree. Under the tree was a high, broad bill board, a squat stool, and two short legged tables. The little old gentleman began to bang his furniture about excitedly. "The tables are turned!" he shouted. "The tables are turned!" "Of course the tables are turned," said Gwendolyn. "But what difference'll that make?" "Difference?" he repeated, tearing back. "It means that from now on everything's going to be exactly opposite to what it has been." "Ooh, goody!" Then lifting a puzzled face, "But why didn't you turn the tables at first? And why didn't we stay here? My mother was here all the time, and " The Man Who Makes Faces regarded her solemnly. "Suppose we hadn't gone around," he said. "Just suppose." Before her in a line were They, the Doctor, the Policeman, Puffy, and the Bird. He indicated them by a nod.
She nodded too, comprehending. "But now," went on the little old gentleman, "we must all absquatulate." He took her hand. "Oh, must you?" she asked regretfully. Absquatulate was a big word, but she understood it, having come across it one day in the dictionary. "Good bye." He leaned down, and she saw that his round black eyes were clouded, while his square brush like brows were working with the effort of keeping back his tears. "Good bye." He stepped back out of the waiting line, turned, and made off slowly, turning the crank of the hand organ as he went. Now the voices of They spoke up. "We also bid you good night," they said politely. "We shall have to go. People must hear about this." And shoulder to shoulder They wheeled, and followed the little old gentleman. "But my Puffy!" said Gwendolyn. "I'd like to keep him. I don't care if he is shabby." For answer there was a crackling and crashing in the underbrush, as if some heavy footed animal were lumbering away. "I think," explained her father, "that he's gone to make some poor little boy very happy." "Oh, the Rich Little Poor Boy, I guess," said Gwendolyn, contented. The Bird was just in front of her. He looked very handsome and bright as he flirted his rudder saucily, and darted now up, now down. Presently he began to sing a glad, clear song and, singing, rose into the air. "Oh," she breathed, "he's happy 'cause he got that salt off his tail." When she looked again at the line, the Policeman was nowhere to be seen. "Doctor!" "Yes." "Don't you go." "The Doctor is right here," said her mother, soothingly. Gwendolyn smiled, and put one hand in the clasp of her mother's, the other in a bigger grasp. "Tired out all tired out," murmured her father. She was sleepy, too, almost past the keeping open of her gray eyes. "Long as you both are with me," she whispered, "I wouldn't mind if I was back in the nursery." The glow that filled the land now seemed suddenly to soften. The clustered tapers had lessened to a single chandelier of 4 globes. Next, the forest trees began to flatten, and take on the appearance of a conventional pattern. The grass became rug like in smoothness. The sky squared itself to the proportions of a ceiling. There was no mistaking the change at hand. "We're getting close," she announced happily. The rose colored light was dim, peaceful. Here and there through it she caught glints of white and gold. Then familiar objects took shape. She made out the pier glass. Flanking it her writing desk, upon which were the 2 silver framed portraits. And there, between the portraits, was the flower embossed calendar, with pencil marks checking off each figure in the lines that led up to her birthday. She sighed a deep, tremulous sigh of content. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Poor Little Rich Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Poor Little Rich Girl by Eleanor Gates. Chapter 16. She moved her head from side to side slowly, and felt the cool touch of the pillow against either cheek. Then she tried to lift her arms, but found that one hand was still in a big grasp, the other in a clasp that was softer. Little by little, and with effort, she opened her gray eyes. In the dimness she could see, to her left, scarcely more than an outline of a dark clad figure, stooped and watchful of that other slender figure opposite. After all the fatigue and worry of the night, her father and mother were with her yet. And some one was standing at the foot of her bed, leaning and looking down at her. That was the Doctor. She lay very still. This was a novel experience, this having both father and mother in the nursery at the same time, and plainly in no haste to depart. The heaviness of deep sleep was gradually leaving her. Yet she forbore to speak, and as each moment went she dreaded the passing of it, lest her wonderful new happiness come to an end. Presently she ventured a look around at the pink tinted ceiling, with its cluster of full blown plaster roses, out of which branched the chandelier; at the walls of soft rose, met here and there by the deeper rows of the brocade hangings; at the plushy rug, the piano, the large table, now scattered with an unusual assortment of bottles and glasses; at the dresser, crystal topped and strewn daintily; the deep upholstered chair; and the long cushioned seat across the front window, over which, strangely enough, no dome topped cage was swinging. And there was the tall toy case. The shelves of it were unchanged. On that one below the line of prettily clad dolls were the toys she favored most: the black and red top, the handsome soldier in the scarlet coat, the jointed snake beside its pipe like box, and the somersault man, poised heels over head. Beyond these, ranged in a buff row, were the 6 small ducks acquired at Easter. She gave each plaything a keen glance. They reminded her vividly of the long, busy night just past. Her small nose wrinkled in a quizzical smile. At that, the 3 waiting figures stirred. Her look came back to them, to rest first upon her father's face, noting how long and pale and haggard it was, how sunken the temples, how bloodless the tightly pressed lips, how hollow the unshaven cheeks. When she turned to gaze at her mother, as daintily clad as ever, and as delicately perfumed, showing no evidence of dusty travel, she saw how pitifully pale was that dear, beautiful face. But the eyes were no longer proud, only anxious, tender, and purple shadowed. Next Gwendolyn lifted her eyes to the Doctor, and felt suddenly conscience stricken, remembering how she had always dreaded him, had taken the mere thought of his coming as punishment; remembering, too, how helpful and kind he had been to her through the night. He began to speak, low and earnestly, and as if continuing something already half said. "Pardon my bluntness, but it's a bad thing when there's too much money spent on forcing the brain before the body is given a chance or the soul. Does a child get food that is simple and nourishing, and enough of it? Is all exercise taken in the open? Too often I find, where there's a motor at the beck and call of a nurse, the child in her charge is utterly cut off, and in the period of quickest growth, from a normal supply of plain walking. Every boy and girl has a right," his voice deepened with feeling, "to the great world out of doors. Let the warm sun, and the fresh air, and God's good earth " Gwendolyn moved. "Is he praying?" she whispered. There was a moment of silence. Then, "No, daughter," answered her father, while her mother leaned to lay a gentle hand on her forehead. The Doctor went aside to the larger table and busied himself with some bottles. When he came back, her father lifted her head a trifle by lifting the pillow, her mother rising quickly to assist,
and the Doctor put a glass to Gwendolyn's lips. She drank dutifully, and was lowered. At once she felt stronger. "Is the sun up?" she asked. Her voice was weak and somewhat hoarse. "Would you like to see the sky?" asked her father. And without waiting for her eager nod, crossed to the front window and drew aside the heavy silk hangings. Serenely blue was the long rectangle framed by curtains and casing. Across it not a single fat sheep was straying.
"Moth er."
"Yes, darling?"
Is it always the same piece of heaven right there through the window?"
"No. The earth is turning all the time, just as your globe in the school room turns. And so each moment you see a new square of sky." The Doctor nodded with satisfaction. "Better, aren't we?" he inquired, smiling down. She returned the smile.
"Well, I am," she declared. "But I didn't know you felt bad."
He laughed. "Tell me something," he went on. "I sent a bottle of medicine here yesterday."
"Yes. It was a little bottle."
"How much of it did Jane give you? Can you remember?"
"Well, first she poured out 1 teaspoonful."
The Doctor had been leaning again on the foot of the white and gold bed. Now he fell back of a sudden. "A teaspoonful!" he gasped. And to Gwendolyn's father, "Why, that wretched girl didn't read the directions on the bottle." There was another silence. The two men stared at each other. But Gwendolyn's mother, her face paler than before, bent above the yellow head on the pillow.
"After I drank that teaspoonful," went on Gwendolyn, "Jane wouldn't believe me. And so she made me take the other."
"Another!" It was the Doctor once more. He pressed a trembling hand to his forehead. Her father rose angrily. "She shall be punished," he declared, and began to walk to and fro. "I won't let this pass." Gwendolyn's look followed him tenderly.
"Well, you see, she didn't know about nursery work," she explained. "'Cause before she came here, she was just a cook."
"Oh, my baby daughter!" murmured Gwendolyn's mother brokenly. She bent forward until her face was hidden against the silken cover of the bed. "Mother didn't know you were being neglected. She thought she was giving you the best of care, dear." "2 spoonfuls," said the Doctor grimly. "That explains everything."
"Oh, but I didn't want to take the last one," protested Gwendolyn hastily. "Though it tasted good. She made me. She said if I didn't
"So!" exclaimed the Doctor, interrupting. "She frightened the poor little helpless thing in order to get obedience."
"Gwendolyn," whispered her mother. "She frightened you?"
The gray eyes smiled wisely.
"It doesn't matter now," she said, a hint of triumph in her voice. "I've found out that policemen are nice. And so are doctors." She dimpled and nodded. "And all the bears in the world that are outside of cages are just Puffy Bears grown up." Then uncertainly, "But I didn't find out about the other."
"What other?" asked her father, pausing in his walk. The gray eyes were diamond bright now.
"Though I don't really believe it," she hastened to add. "But do wicked men keep watch of this house?"
"Wicked men!" Her mother suddenly straightened.
"Kidnapers."
This innocent statement had an unexpected effect. Again her father began to stride up and down angrily. while her mother, head drooping once more, began to weep.
"Oh, Mother didn't know!" she sobbed. "Mother didn't guess what terrible things were happening. Oh, forgive her! Forgive her!"
The doctor came to her side. "Too much excitement for the patient," he reminded her. "Don't you think you'd better go and lie down for a while and have a little rest?" A startled look, and Gwendolyn put out a staying hand to her mother. Then, "Mother is tired," she assented. "She's tireder than I am, 'cause it was hard work going round and round Robin Hood's barn." The doctor hunted a small wrist and felt the pulse in it. "That's all right," he said to her mother in an undertone. "Everything's still pretty real to her, you see, but her pulse is normal." He laid cool fingers across her forehead. "Temperature's almost normal, too." Gwendolyn felt that she had not made herself altogether clear. She hastened to explain. "I mean," she said, "when Mother was carrying that society bee in her bonnet." Confusion showed in the doctor's quick glance from parent to parent. Then, "I think I'll just drop down into the pantry," he said hastily, "and see how that young nurse from over yonder is getting along." He jerked a thumb in the direction of the side window as he went out. Gwendolyn wondered just who the young nurse was. She opened her lips to ask, then saw how painfully her mother had colored at the mere mention of the person in question, and so kept silence. The doctor gone, her father came to her mother's side and patted a shoulder. "Well, we shan't ever say anything more about that bee," he declared, laughing, yet serious enough. "Shall we, Gwendolyn?"
"No."
She blinked, puzzling over it a little. "There! It's settled." He bent and kissed his wife. "You thought you were doing the best thing for our little girl. I know that, dear. You had her future in mind. And it's natural and right for a mother to think of making friends the right kind, too and a place in the social world for her daughter. And I've been short sighted and neglectful and oh!" She raised wet eyes to him. "You had your worries. You were doing more than your share. You had to meet the question of money, while I " He interrupted her. "We both thought we were doing our very best," he declared. "We almost did our worst. Oh, what would it all have amounted to what would anything have mattered if we'd lost our little girl?" The pink came rushing to Gwendolyn's cheeks.
"Why, I wasn't lost at all," she declared happily. "And oh, it was so good to have my questions all answered, and understand so many things I didn't once, and to be where all the put out lights go, and where soda water comes from. And I was so glad to get rid of Thomas and Jane and Miss Royle and " The hall door opened. She checked herself to look that way. Some one was entering with a tray. It was a maid. A maid wearing a sugar bowl cap! Gwendolyn knew her instantly. That pretty face, as full and rosy as the face of the French doll, and framed by saucy wisps and curls as fair as Gwendolyn's own. And freckleless! "Oh!" It was a low cry of delight. The nurse smiled. She had a tray in one hand. On the tray was a blue bowl of something steaming hot. She set the tray down and came to the bedside. Gwendolyn's eyes were wide with wonder. How she began. Her mother answered. "Jane called down to the policeman, and he ran to the house on the corner." Now the dimples sprang into place. "Goody!" exclaimed Gwendolyn, and gave a little chuckle.
Her mother went on. "We never can feel grateful enough to her, because she was such a help. And we're so glad you're friends already." Gwendolyn nodded. "She's one of my window friends," she explained. "I'm going to stay with you," said the nurse. She smoothed Gwendolyn's hair fondly. "Will you like that?" "It's fine! I wanted you." The Doctor re entered. "Well, how does our sharp little patient feel now?" he inquired. "I feel hungry." "I have some broth for you," announced the pretty nurse, and brought forward the tray. Gwendolyn looked down at the bowl. "Mmm," she breathed. "It smells good. Now," to the Doctor, "if I had one of your nice bread pills." At that, curiously enough, every one laughed, the Doctor heartiest of all. And "Hush!" chided her mother, gently, while the Doctor shook a teasing finger. "Just for that," said he, "we'll have eating and no conversation for 5 whole minutes." Whereupon he began to scribble on a pad, laughing to himself every now and then as he wrote. "That must be a cheerful prescription," observed Gwendolyn's father, he himself looking happier than he had. "The country," answered the Doctor, "is always cheerful." Gwendolyn's spoon slipped from her fingers. She lifted eager, shining eyes. "Moth er," she half whispered, "does the Doctor mean Johnnie Blake's?" The Doctor assented energetically. "I prescribe Johnnie Blake's," he declared. "Ah!" It was a deep breath of happiness. "I promised Johnnie that I'd come back." "But if my little daughter isn't strong " Her father gave a sidewise glance at the steaming bowl on the tray. Thus prompted, Gwendolyn fell to eating once more, turning her attention to the croutons bobbing about on the broth. Each was square and crunchy, but not so brown as a bread pill. "I shall now read my Johnnie Blake prescription," announced the Doctor, and held up a leaf from the pad. Then, in a business like tone, "Take 2 pairs of sandals, a dozen cheap gingham dresses with plenty of pockets and extra pieces for patches, and a bottle of something good for wild blackberry scratches." He bowed. "Mix all together with 1 strong medium sized garden hoe." "Oh, fath er!" cried Gwendolyn, her hoarse voice wistful with pleading. "You won't mind if I play with Johnnie, will you?" "Play all the time," answered her father. "Play hard. And then play some more." "He isn't a common little boy." Whereupon, satisfied, she returned to the blue bowl. "And now," went on the Doctor, "as to directions." He held up other leaves from the pad. "First week you'll have to go easy the first week. Use the prescription each day as follows: when driving, also when lying on back watching birds and trees, and have a nap out of doors if you feel like it, also when lighting the fire at sundown. Nurse here will watch out for fingers." At that another pleased little chuckle. "Second week," the Doctor coughed importantly, "when riding your own fat pony, or chasing butterflies, assisted by 1 good natured, common, ordinary, long haired dog, or when fishing stream or bath tub, it doesn't matter or carrying kindling in to cook, whether you're tired or not."
I love it.
Third week, when baking mud pies or gathering ferns (but put 'em in water when you get home), when jaunting an old wagon to hayfield, orchard, or vegetable patch (this includes tomboy yelling), and go barefoot. Gwendolyn's spoon, crouton laden, wobbled in mid air.
Go barefoot?
she repeated, small face flushing to a pleased pink. "Right away? Before I'm 8?"
assented the Doctor. "And shin up trees. But don't disturb eggs if you find 'em. Also do barefoot gardening, where there isn't a plant to hurt. And wade in the creek."
Again the dimples came rushing to their places. "I like squashing," she declared, smiling round.
"Then isn't there a hill to climb," continued the Doctor, "with your hat down your back on a string? And stones to roll?"
The small face grew suddenly serious. "No, thank you," she said, with a slow shake of the head. "I'd rather not turn any stones."
"Very well. "Oh, and there'll be jolly times of an evening after supper," broke in her father, enthusiastically.
The stern lines of his face were relaxed, and a score of tiny ripples were carrying a smile from his mouth to his tired eyes. "We'll light all the candles."
"Daddy!"
She relinquished the bowl and turned to him swiftly.
"Not candles that burn at both ends?"
"No." He stopped smiling.
"You're a wise little body," pronounced the Doctor, taking her hand.
"How's the pulse now?" asked her mother. "Somehow," with a nervous little laugh, "she makes me anxious."
"Normal," answered the Doctor, promptly. "Only thing that isn't normal about her is that busy brain, which is abnormally bright." Thereupon he shook the small hand he was holding, strode to the table, and picked up a leather covered case. It was black, and held a number of bottles. In no way did it resemble the pill basket. And if a certain person is to leave for the country soon Gwendolyn's smile was knowing.
"You mean a certain party?"
He was trying to tease her with that old nursery name. "She'd better rest. Good by."
And with that mild advice he beckoned the nurse to follow him, whispered with her a moment at the door, and was gone. Gwendolyn's father resumed his place beside the bed.
"She can rest," he declared. "The blessed baby! Not a governess or a teacher is to show as much as a hat feather."
She nodded.
"We don't want 'em quacking around."
Some one tapped at the door then, and entered. Rosa, bearing a card tray upon which were two square bits of pasteboard.
"To see Madam," she said,
presenting the tray. After which she showed her white teeth in greeting to Gwendolyn, then stooped and touched an open palm with her lips. Gwendolyn's mother read the cards and shook her head. "Tell the ladies explain that I can't leave my little daughter even for a moment to day." "Oh, yes, Madam." "And that we're leaving for the country very soon." Rosa bobbed her dark head as she backed away.
"And Rosa."
"Yes, Madam?" "You know what I need in the country, where we were before." A bow. "Pack, Rosa. And you will go, of course." "And Potter, Madam?" "Potter, too. You'll have to pack a few things up here also." A white hand indicated the wardrobe door. "Very well, Madam." As the door closed, the telephone rang. Gwendolyn's father rose to answer it.
"I think it's the office, dear," he explained, and into the transmitter, "Yes? Hello? Yes, good morning. Oh, thanks. She's better. And by the way, just close out that line of stocks. Yes. I shan't be back in the office for some time. I'm leaving for the country as soon as Gwendolyn can stand the trip. To morrow, maybe, or the next day. No, don't go into the market until I come back. I intend to reconstruct my policy a good deal. Yes, oh, yes. Good by." He went to the front window.
And as he stood in the light, Gwendolyn lay and looked at him. He had worn green the night before. But now there was not a vestige of paper money showing anywhere in his dress. In fact, he was wearing the suit a dark blue he had worn that night she penetrated to the library. "Fath er." "Well, little daughter?" "I was wondering, has anybody scribbled on the General's horse with chalk?" Her father looked down at the Drive. "The General's there," he announced, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "And his horse seems in fine fettle this morning, prancing and arching his neck. And nobody's scribbled on him, which seems to please the General very much, for he's got his hat off." Gwendolyn sat up, her eyes rounding. "To hundreds and hundreds of soldiers," she told her mother. "Only everybody can't see the soldiers." Her father came back to her. "I can," he declared proudly. "Do you want to see 'em, too? Just a glimpse, mother. Come, we'll play the game together." And the next moment, silk coverlet and all, Gwendolyn was swung up in his arms and borne to the window seat. "And oh, there's the Policeman!" she cried out. "His name is Flynn," informed her father. "And twice this morning he's asked after you." "Oh!" She stood up among the cushions to get a better view. "He takes lost little boys and girls to their fathers and mothers, Daddy. And he takes care of the trees and the flowers and the fountains and the ob'lisk. But he only likes it up here in summer. In winter he likes to be down town. And he ought to be down town, 'cause he's got a really level head." "Wave to him now," said her father. "There! He's swinging his cap. When we're out walking one of these times, we'll stop and shake hands with him." "With the hand organ man, too, fath er? Oh, you like him, don't you? And you won't send him away?" "Father won't." He laid her back among the pillows then, and she turned her face to her mother. "Can't you sleep, darling? And don't dream." "Well, I'm pretty tired." "We know what a hard, long night it was." "Oh, I'm so glad we're going back to Johnnie Blake's, mother. 'Cause, oh, I'm tired of pretending." "Of pretending," said her father. "Ah, yes." Her mother nodded at him. "I'm tired of pretending, too," she said in a low voice. Gwendolyn looked pleased. "I didn't know you ever pretended," she said. "Well, of course, you know that real things are so much nicer." "Ah, yes, my little girl." It was her father. His voice trembled. "Real grass," she smiled up at him. "And real trees and real people." After that, for a while, she gave herself over to thinking. How wonderful that one single night could bring about the changes for which she had so longed the living in the country, the eating at the grown up table, and having no governess. One full, busy night had done all that. And yet She glanced down at herself. Under her pink chin was the lace and ribbon of a night dress. She could not remember being put to bed could not even recall coming up in the bronze cage. And was the plaid gingham with the patch pocket now hanging in the wardrobe? Brows knit, she slipped one small foot sidewise until it was close to the edge of the bed covers, then of a sudden thrust it out from beneath them. The foot was as white as if it had only just been bathed. Not a sign did it show of having waded any stream, pattered through mud, or trudged a forest road. Presently,
"Moth er,"
sleepily. "Yes, darling." "Who are law and order?" A moment's silence. Then, "Well
Er
Isn't it a father and mother question?" "Why, yes, my baby. But I " "Father will tell you, dear." He was seated beside her once more. "You see, it's this way." "Can you tell it like a story, fath er?" "Yes." "A once upon a time story?" "I'll try. But first you must understand that Law and Order are not two people. Oh, no. And they aren't anything a little girl could see as she can see the mirror, for instance, or a chair." Gwendolyn looked at the mirror and the chair, thence around the room. These were the same things that had been there all the time. Now how different each appeared! There was the bed, for instance. She had never liked the bed, beautiful though it was. Yet to day, even with the sun shining on the great panes of the wide front window, it seemed good to be lying in it. And the nursery, once a hated place, a very prison, the nursery had never looked lovelier. Her father went on with his explaining, low and cheerily, and as confidentially as if to a grown up. Across from him, listening, was her mother, one soft cheek lowered to rest close to the small face half hidden in the pillow. When her father finished speaking, Gwendolyn gave a deep breath of happiness and content. Then, "Moth er." "Yes?" with a kiss as light as the touch of a butterfly. Her eyelids all at once seemed curiously heavy. She let them flutter down. But a drowsy smile curved the pink mouth. "Moth er," she whispered, "moth er, the dearest pretend has come true." End of Chapter 16. End of The Poor Little Rich Girl by Eleanor Gates.